Welcome to another episode of Jamming with Jason. Hey, today we're going to talk about the right tool for the job. So, I was just recently introduced to a new song that I'm going to talk about. And sometimes, a knife is better than a spoon or a fork is better than a spoon or a knife. And we're going to talk more about that and how that actually applies in your life. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so I was introduced to a new song that I hadn't heard before, and it's called Right Tool for the Job by Marcia Ball. And I put a link in the description here so you can go back and listen to it. It's actually a great song. There's some wonderful guitar picking and everything in it. It's got a nice beat to it, uh, and some lyrics that are actually pretty good to listen to, and really kind of hits the point. And so again, like usual, I got introduced to a song and I was thinking about it, and so here we go. We're doing an episode on the right tool for the job. Now, we're going to talk about tools and we're going to talk about some other things. But again, what we're talking about is not really what we're talking about. So think about or figure out how you can apply this into your particular life. Okay. So I'm going to start off maybe telling some stories and doing some things. One of my favorite poems that I can remember from Shel Silverstein. If you're familiar with him, he wrote a lot of what are usually considered to be children's poems, but I actually still like him because I'm a child at heart. And he was a very interesting man. Maybe I'll tell you more stories about him later. But anyway, Shel Silverstein, in one of his poems, it says this. It says, I like to eat my peas with honey. I've done it all my life. It makes my peas taste funny, but it keeps them on my knife. Okay, so let me and I'm laughing because it makes me laugh. So let me say that again. I eat my peas with honey. I've done it all my life. It makes my peas taste funny, but it keeps them on my knife. Okay, so here we have a silly example of poetry. And if you're eating peas, typically the tools that we use in eating, at least in the Western world where we use silverware, is a fork, a knife, and a spoon, right? A lot of the world still eats with their hands. In fact, it's a great way to eat. It's here I'm making this motion like I'm going to be eating out of my hands. Anyway, um, so in that instance, right, Shel Silverstein had to eat his peas with honey. Why? Well, it made him taste funny, but they would stick to his knife, right? Because again, imagine trying to eat peas if all you have is a knife. A knife is a good tool, but it's not necessarily the right tool for the job. A spoon or a fork might be a better option, right? And again, people can debate back and forth over whether a fork or a spoon is better to eat peas with. I'm probably of the camp that peas are probably easier eaten with a spoon because they like to roll around, but I know some people like to kind of mash them with their fork and eat them that way. So it doesn't matter how you do it, whether you use a knife, a spoon, or a fork, but there's probably one of those that would work better for you. Okay. And again, in the spirit of being authentic, in the spirit of me not telling you what to do, you would have to decide, is a fork or a spoon better for you? Maybe you say the knife is. That's fine too, right? But there's probably a better tool to use in certain situations. Now, there's another saying that goes like this: to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay, again, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay, and so again, I grew up on the construction site with my dad. I have lots of tools. I have some hammers that I very much like. I tend to invest in high quality tools when I buy tools because I use them a lot. I have them for my life. And so I have some really good hammers. And I remember as a kid, one of the guys because I started going to work with my dad when I was 8. So I was on the job site at 8. And yes, don't worry, I did go to school too, and I graduated, but I did start working on construction sites when I was 8. And so, when I was really little, there were only certain things I could do. And so a lot of times I would have some time to sit because, maybe the work that we were doing at the time was not something that I could do. And one of my favorite things to do was to sit and watch the guy who did the finish concrete work for my dad. And so finish concrete is, if you think about your driveway or sidewalks or things like that, they pour the concrete and then they spread it out, and then somebody sits with a trowel and rubs it and puts it into place. And it's very it's there's a skill to it. You have to know what you're doing, or else it comes out kind of lumpy. It's not level. The water doesn't drain where it needs to go. It can be rough, if you don't know what you're doing. So it's really kind of an art form to do finish concrete work. And so I used to love to sit and watch this guy do his work because he was really an artist in what he did. And there were certain tools that he would use, certain kinds of trowels and what we call a float. And, obviously he had to use shovels, but he also had a hammer because when you're doing finish concrete work, usually you have to put out forms. So you create like a box, and you use things like 2x4s. If it's most slabs are 4 inches thick, so you use 2x4s, and you have to cut them and nail them together, and then you pour the concrete on the inside of the form. So it creates, the box or the rectangle or whatever it is that you're trying to make. And so this guy, and I can't remember his name. I wish I could remember his name because I can see his face, and he brings me a lot of memories, and I'm sure he's passed on by now, as most of the people that I worked with my dad have done. Um, but I remember him telling me, because I would sit there and watch him, and so he would talk to me as he was working, and kind of give me advice. And I I remember this. There were two stories about him. One is, a circular saw, a skill saw. My dad always used to say he cut circles with a circular saw because he could never cut a straight line with a skill saw. But again, that wasn't, his primary focus wasn't in cutting lumber straight, where it was for my dad in doing finish work and framing and things like that. So I had to learn how to cut very straight. But he didn't necessarily have to, and so he'd just cut it the way that he cut it, right? But he would have to nail the boards together. And I remember watching him one time because there's a certain kind of nails that usually he would use because you don't pound them all the way in, or they're a double-headed nail because you have to take apart the whatever you call it, the forms after you pour the concrete, and so it makes it easy to pull the nails out because they have to stick out a little bit because there's two heads on them. And so those were the kind of nails that he used most of the time. And again, those nails were a better tool for what he was doing than the 16 penny nails we were using in framing, right? Because you don't want those to come out. You don't want to have to pull those out. In fact, we had a special tool to help us get those nails out if we needed to, because they were sunk all the way into the wood. And so I remember, watching him one day, and he was going through pounding everything in. And for some reason, I think he ran out of nails or something like that, or he had some screws. And he just picked up a screw and he just pounded it into the board with the hammer. And I'm sitting there like all aghast, like, man, screws, you use a screwdriver, or you use a drill on, right? And he probably saw this kind of panicked look on my face and he turned around and he said, nah. He said, don't worry, screwdrivers are only for getting screws out. Hammers put them in just fine. I always remember that. Yeah, you can put in screws with a hammer. Sometimes they break because they're not designed to be pounded on like nails are. So actually the tensile structure of the metal is not the same. But anyway, see again, there we're talking again about the right tool for the right job. There's certain things where nails work better than screws do. And so if it's an application where you need to use screws, then using a screwdriver or a drill is probably a better option than using a hammer, even though you could probably still use a hammer. Just like you wouldn't use a screwdriver to put a nail in either, right? You'd use a hammer. And so you've got to think about, as you're going through and doing different things in your life, what's the right tool for the job? Okay. And we can look at it, and again, like I said, the everything looks like a nail to the hammer. So when that man was pounding the screw in, to go along with that saying, right, the hammer sees the screw as a nail, and I can just pound a U in to the wood just like I do a nail, right? Well, and if you stop and think about it, right, and let's apply this to ourselves. Well, you may have a really nice hammer. I have some really nice hammers that I like to use. But just because I have a nice hammer doesn't mean that's the right tool for the job. Okay. I may be a good hammer, but those skill sets that I've developed and I'm very good at may not be the right tool for the job. Okay. And so again, a little about me. I've always kind of been a nerd and personal development junkie. So when I was 12 or 13 years old, I started reading personal development books, self-help books. I had a Franklin Day Planner that I would use. And so I really started from a young age. And why did I do that? Because I realized that I need lots of skills in my life. I need lots of tools in my life in order to accomplish what I want to accomplish, right? And so because of that, I need to develop myself and learn how to do things different, learn some different skills, develop some different things to in my toolbox. Sometimes when I am coaching leaders, I talk about that. I talk about kind of like a tool belt or a toolbox, and we're just adding another tool into your box, right? And so, as an example, I have a whole list of what I call ninja phrases and questions. They're kind of these Jedi mind tricks. And so I've got a whole bunch of these different questions and sayings that you could use as a leader. And depending on the situation that you're in, some or one or many of them may be appropriate to use, but in other times they might not be, right? So, I'll just give you an example. One of them is a question that says, well, I'm curious what you mean by that. Okay, that's a great question if you are trying to understand better what somebody is meaning so that you can communicate better. That is a great question that you can use in a lot of situations. But it's not appropriate in all situations, or it's not the best question that you could ask in every situation. So I want you to kind of, stop and think about some of the areas in your life. Are there certain relationships that maybe you're having more difficulty with? Are there certain places where you're more challenged in your life than in others? Well, maybe it's because you need to learn how to be a screwdriver instead of a hammer, right? And by acquiring some screwdriver skills, whatever those may be, that will make it easier in your life, right? Because now you will have the right tool for the job. Okay. Now, again, this has applications in lots of places in our life. So, as an example, I've been in several different long term, we'll call them romantic partner type relationships with people. And each person is different. And so, with each relationship, I have to adapt, I have to learn, I have to do things a little bit different. Some things that I've learned from previous relationships serve me well. They're a good tool for me to use. But sometimes I need to learn something else. I need to learn how to do it different. I need to learn how to use a new tool. I need to figure out, through training, through reading, through other things to find out what some of these other tools are, and then I need to apply and use the tool differently. Okay. And again, sometimes there are, certain applications where only a certain tool can really do the job right. There's other times when a lot of the tools that we use can be interchangeable. And so, knowing how to use a hammer well and how to, hammer in a nail is a good skill to have, but so are some other skills as well, right? And so in your life, where are some of those things that you could work on? Or maybe you could develop a new skill or tool around. And the reason that I ask you, what areas or maybe what relationships are you having some challenges with? Because that's a way to help you understand when you're using the wrong tool. Okay, so if I'm pounding screws in with my hammer, those screws are going to keep breaking. Sometimes I might be able to hit them and get them all the way in, but chances are most of the time I'm going to hit that screw a few times and that screw is going to break. And it's going to make it very hard for me to nail together whatever I'm trying to nail together. And so I can identify that and say, why is it so difficult for me to do this? And I can stop and I can assess what's going on and I can say, oh, well, I'm actually hammering now instead of screwing. So maybe I should use a nail instead of a screw, right? Or the other way around. I just did this 2 days, 3 days ago. I was screwing in a screw with my drill, or drive, and the problem was the screw. It was a Phillips screw, and it was a smaller size than my drill bit, and so they were a cheaper screw, and so the problem was when I put my drill bit in that was a little bit too big, it spun and stripped out the screw when it was only halfway in. So I had my drill in my hand, didn't have my hammer, that was in the garage because I was just screwing in one screw. And so what did I do? I picked up my drill and I pounded that screw with my drill. Not the smartest idea. In fact, as I was doing it, I thought this is probably not a good idea. I could break my drill or break my battery. Now, I didn't, but again, that was probably not the right tool for the job. I should have taken the screw out. I should have instead gotten a small nail because that's what I needed. I should have used my hammer and nailed in a small nail to hang up what I was hanging because it had a very small hole in the back instead of trying to use a small headed screw. Okay. So, again, the right tool for the right job. Are you using the right tools for the right job? Now, give you another example here as well, okay? Is, depending on what you're doing, a lot of times we rely on our logical thinking. We rely on our brain in order to work through things. Okay. And sometimes your brain is the right tool for the job. Other times it's not the best tool. And in fact, it can lead to some challenges, to some, questions, to some frustrations when we're trying to use our brain, when instead, maybe we should be using our heart. And so I don't know if you ever thought about that, but let me just kind of explain. If you're working on a math problem, it's probably a good idea to use your brain, your logical brain, to remember the steps and how to work through doing the math problem. Because the math problem is a linear kind of logic related thing that you're doing. And so relying on your brain is probably a good idea. For making certain decisions, sometimes your brain is okay as well, right? Because you can kind of quickly, logically make certain decisions by using the logic in your brain, especially if these are decisions that don't really have long term or significant consequences if you make the wrong decision. Okay. And you can get as complex as you want to by calculating numbers and doing a bunch of analytics and other stuff to use your logical brain to make a decision. But sometimes decisions are better made with your heart or with your gut. And why is that? Because sometimes those decisions have nothing to do with logic. They have to do with things like love, right? Or different emotions and things that you feel in your gut. Maybe they are more of a spiritual nature. Maybe they relate more to a relationship issue. Maybe they relate more to emotions. And trying to use your brain when you're dealing with emotions is not the right tool for the job. Using your heart or your gut are a better tool when you're dealing with emotional or spiritual kinds of things. So, as an example, right now, if you're trying to make an example or make a decision, a certain decision in my life that I'm trying to make now, uh, I'm not sure what to do because logically, and I've thought about this logically for a little while, right? And I can do little T accounts with advantages, disadvantages, do it, not do it, and kind of logically go through, but I don't get a definitive answer, right? Because there's about as many positives as there are negatives. And so from a logical standpoint, I'm kind of stuck at that point, right? And and if I only try to use my logical brain, I'm going to stay confused and I'm not going to know necessarily what decision to make. And so for the last little while, I've been getting more into my heart and into my gut, if you will. And I'm just using those as other uh, parts of our body and metaphorically, but not just metaphorically, about how we can make decisions when we tune into ourselves and allow, call it your soul, your higher self, whatever you want to call it, to actually help us in making the decision because it knows what's best. And so I'm getting into that more. Now I'm getting some conflicting things too. Sometimes it's like, yeah, do this. Other times it's no, do that. And the reason for that is there are many, 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 many different scenarios that this decision could lead to, or many different options of this particular decision. And so, again, if I logically try to just sit with it, it's not going to work. If I get into my heart and my gut and feel into the decision, then I can make a better decision because now I can start to see how I'm actually feeling. Do I feel good about it? Am I excited about the prospects of that? Or am I a little fearful or anxious about what might happen? And so when you're doing that, you can kind of go through different scenarios. And I'm going to use the example of Dune 2, the second Dune movie that just came out. I just watched it. And there's one part in the movie where the character drinks the blue liquid and now all of a sudden can start to see the future. Now, one thing about seeing the future is you can see different possibilities based on decisions that you make. And so in the movie, in this scene, these two people are talking. And it's like, well, are we going to be successful? Right? Is kind of the question. And the one character says, I see many different possibilities in the future. And in almost all of them, we lose. But in this one, I think if we follow this route, it seems we will be successful. But it's a very narrow window. We have to do things in a certain way for everything to line up for us to be successful. Now, that process and kind of thinking into and feeling into and playing out in your mind what the different scenarios are is more about feeling into it with your heart or your gut. Because at the end of the day, a lot of times it doesn't matter what you choose, but every choice has consequences. And so the more you can start thinking this way, you can start working through different scenarios, see what happens at the end of the scenarios as you look into the future and as you feel into yourself. And then you can choose which path you prefer to take. It may be a different decision than I make. It doesn't matter because it's your life, right? I may make a different choice. It doesn't matter to you because it's my life, right? But as we get used to that, as we start using even our heart and our gut as the right tool in the right situation, things start changing for us. And you may think, it has nothing to do with what we've been talking about today, but I will tell you, it does. And the more you can get out of your head in making the decisions that you need to with your heart or your gut, the happier you will be. The more successful you will be, the less challenges you will encounter than if you try to use the wrong tool at the wrong time. Okay. So, with that, I'm going to wrap up for the day and just reminder again for you to start thinking in your life. Where are certain areas in your life that maybe there's a better tool to do that job? What's the right tool for the right job? And if you don't have that tool already, then figuratively go out and buy it, learn how to do it, find somebody that knows how to do it. It's the same thing when I do a new, home project that I've never done before. I'll call my dad or my brother or somebody who may have done it before. I'll go and look at YouTube videos or other things to understand how to do it, right? Because I'm developing and learning and training myself on how to do that. Same thing for you, right? So what are things that you need to find to make sure that you have the right tools when you need them? Because it is important to make sure that you have the right tool for the job. And with that, I'm going to sign off for this week, and I'll see you on the next episode. Have a great week.